If society is collapsing and government officials and political parties don't have the solution, if the fabric is undone and Americans are trying to destroy the loom upon which it was woven, and money cannot stop them, if truth is rejected for lies or incorporated into conspiracies to the point of being uncertain, if a parallel society simply adds to division as well, if the weight of the problem is so heavy and the shadow it casts so vast that no one realizes they are standing in the shade unable to breathe, we may be tempted to take the path of least resistance and give up the fight for truth, liberty, equality, rights, and justice. The words will just be redefined anyway, and everyone will inevitably come to believe in the new definitions. Why not just hand ourselves over to the river and see where it takes us? The fight is exhausting, and the odds are not in our favor. The damage is done, the country is coming apart at the seams, and it appears to be next to impossible to do anything about it. There are those who believe it will take a revolution. With the current state of division prevalent, two things are apparent when it comes to revolution. We are no longer a religious and moral people, and the government is unfit for any other. So to assume that a revolution would lead back to constitutionalism and a reliance on natural law is not only naive, but dangerous. Internal revolutions in the last century, regardless of their good intentions, have across the board resulted in outcomes decidedly worse than what the people were revolting against. There is no guarantee that what would result from revolution would be better than what we currently have, in other words. Whereas we might actually want a restoration, a revolution is much more likely to result in more tyranny, not less. And that leads to the second obvious problem with revolution as a solution, as there is no clear enemy like the colonies had in 1776. And if the American people want to take up arms against their own government, does that mean a civilian army is ready to take on a unified military, army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, Space Force? There is no invading military of another nation to fight against. Americans would be fighting Americans, and it would not be a fair fight with tanks, bombs, missiles, and a nationally organized hierarchical command structure on the side Americans believe they want to revolt against. Although the American colonies were the underdogs in 1776 too. Would some military refuse orders to kill civilians? They did in Syria, leading to conditions ripe for extremists to take over materiel and personnel and reshape the revolution to fit their own goals. And then, doesn't this really just become a civil war? Such a civil war would again have no regional, geographic, or even leadership clarity. There is no North versus South. Are there any geographical fronts that would make sense in this country? The two Americas referenced by so many in the media are not even described the same by both Americas. Is it red state versus blue state? Democrat versus Republican? Urban versus rural? God-fearing versus atheist, agnostic, apatheist? Farmland versus industry? Economically solvent versus economically struggling? Rich versus poor or middle class? If the first U.S. Civil War was messy, imagine an armed conflict with no defined borders or obvious areas to defend. Can a country go to war with itself over ideas? And similar to democracy, the ideas of the population left standing after all the dust settles are the winners, and anyone left on the losing side has to submit to the will of the winning side? Democracy, as abhorrent as it is to me as a political system, happens to be the non-violent way to fight a civil war with no boundaries. Today, I actually think a civil war or a second American Revolution, Americans revolting against their own government, is less likely than Americans actually inviting tyranny over themselves. In my own life, I talk about several ways it could happen, quote, tomorrow. And one way would be a coordinated attack by jihadi cells all across the country, or the failure of the electrical grid, or any number of other chaos-inducing emergencies. And I believe the American people, in any of those kinds of cases, would actually invite tyranny over themselves in exchange for order and security and peace. Americans may even beg government to suspend the Constitution. Again, because they will see themselves as being on the right side. And to squash the violence of the wrong side, they will be willing to suspend all their own rights and liberties so their enemies can, quote, be taken out. I mean, I know I digress, but revolution and civil war are not the answer, okay? There are real human lives at stake. What about legal dissolution using the Republican framework? Small r, Republican framework. Couldn't our U.S. senators and U.S. House representatives come to some sort of geographical split to accommodate the dominant populations within a specific region? Democracy would again play a role at a smaller or lower level in determining which direction said region would lean. Again, there are no easily defined boundaries to set up geographical countries adjacent to accommodate the political polarization. Not to mention the vast number of counties in Middle America would go one way, but several cities in the same swath of territory would desire to attach themselves to the minority view. What about 4 countries instead of 2? What about dissolving the United States and each state becomes its own country? Maybe the smaller states to the north could decide to join together but not be forced to. The US could become more like the European Union, where people can move freely about, use the same currency, but have their own laws, their own elections, their own armies, with no centrally designed regulatory agencies, and the Congress and president have no power. There would be no more US military. The Supreme Court would simply adjudicate disputes between states. There would be no federal income tax, and the constitutions would have to be recreated at the state level. California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas would be responsible for their own shared border with Mexico, but also their shared borders with each other. What would happen to or with Alaska or Hawaii? The reality is, it would be better for those already in power in Washington, D.C. to do what is right. But not only does what is right vary from state to state, from party to party, but from official to official. Is it right to abolish and replace Social Security, Medicare? Is it right to dissolve the FDA, OSHA, the EPA, the CPSC? What about the FBI, the CIA? Is it right to establish universal basic income, nationalize healthcare, to mandate electric vehicles, to outlaw fossil fuels? Again, who gets to decide what is right? And we are right back where we started. In addition, it appears that those in power are part of the deep state, or somehow beholden to them by threats or money. Their decisions are not actually their own. They cannot be counted on to do the right thing to avoid conflict, to assuage the populace, to protect rights and liberty for all. They are most consumed with their own power and therefore are the last people who would reign in their own power and relinquish power back to the people they are supposed to represent. Which is why the Article 5 provision for a constitutional convention was put into the Constitution. Madison et al. Knew there would come a time where the corruption and power placed in government officials would need to be curtailed, and it would be impossible for the government to do it to themselves. But even the Article 5 process relies upon state governments as well as the delegates who would be sent to the convention. And where it stands now, at publication, I think resolutions were passed in 19 states. It might be in the 20s now. But 34 states are needed to call the convention. So how long will it be before a convention is called? How long before the convention produces amendments? And who will enforce the amendments designed to take power away from the people in power? What will implementation look like? The pillars are rubble and the fabric just threads already. It is over now, and political, legal, constitutional, and administrative solutions take time. So what can we do? That is a great question, and the title of chapter 17, the last full chapter of this book. I can't believe this project is almost complete. I do hope you'll hang in there through the very last episode.